Wonderful. So let's get going then. Well, depending where you are, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martin Klimke. I'm the PI of the Humanities Research Fellowship Program for the Study of the Arab World. And this is our first seminar this semester. And we're very, very happy to welcome Chris Lowe as a speaker today. As in the past, I think these seminars are designed to give the fellows a platform to present their research and to facilitate engage dialogue and conversation, among the fellows, but also, with the interested community at large. So we're going to follow on that particular tradition. As we started instituting last year, we also always have a dear colleague, presenting and moderating the discussion and commenting on the paper, and we have that today as well. Given the Zoom world that has captured all of us, we've decided sort of to limit these seminars to 60 minutes, which should be fine enough as long as nobody gives a long introduction like me. So this is my cue. I'm gonna step up and hand it over to our dear colleague, Sufan Kimitsialtin. Sufan is a scholar of Middle Eastern history and culture, specializing in the modern period. She received her PhD in history from the University of Texas in Austin, and she's a visiting scholar at NYU Abu Dhabi. We're very, very happy that she has volunteered to moderate this particular event. So, Sufan, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Martin, for the kind introduction. And hi, everyone. It's my pleasure today to introduce Michael Christopher Lowe, a historian of the Middle East and a fellow Ottomanist. Chris is currently a senior humanities research fellow for the study of the Arab world at NYU AD. And this afternoon, he is going to be talking about his research on the recurrent waves of cholera pandemic that originated in British India and spread across the globe starting in the 1820s. Chris received his PhD from Columbia University and is currently an assistant professor of history at Iowa State University. His research centers on the late Ottoman Empire, the Arabian Peninsula, the Indian Ocean world, and environmental history. Chris has recently been named a 2020 recipient of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Emerging Faculty Leaders Award for his role in raising Iowa State's profile in the area of environmental history. And he's currently coordinating Iowa State's institutional contributions to a multi-year international project titled Appraising Risk Past and Present, interrogating historical data to enhance understanding of environmental crisis in the Indian Ocean world. Chris is also the author of a brand new monograph that came out just last week, titled Imperial Mecca, Ottoman Arabia and the Indian Ocean Hajj, drawing on Ottoman and British archival sources, as well as published materials in Arabic and modern Turkish. Imperial Mecca analyzes how the Hijaz and the steamship era pilgrimage to Mecca simultaneously became objects of Ottoman modernization, global public health, international law, and inter-imperial competition during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He is also the co-editor of the Subjects of Ottoman International Law, which I believe is also coming out later this month, right?
This week, actually.
This week. Congratulations on that too. It is a state-of-the-field volume on Ottoman social legal studies, particularly on Ottoman international law from the 18th century to the end of the empire. And his talk today draws on his Imperial Mecca monograph, and we'll be focusing on a major global health crisis that emerged in the early 19th century. That is the recurring waves of cholera pandemic, which spread via the Indian Ocean Hajj routes to the Middle East and Europe, and from there to the rest of the world. We are going to hear about the development of Ottoman and international quarantine and public health controls, which were put in place in the Hijaz, Red Sea, and Persian Gulf area in response to this Hajj-related cholera pandemic. I don't know if Chris expected that his work would be of such immediate relevance to what's going on in the world today when he was conducting his research. This is not something that happens to historians quite often. But his talk is sure to provide important historical insights on some of the questions that are pertinent to our current conversations and situations, such as public health management, mass mobility, travel restrictions, and border controls. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing it. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Suphan. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So can everyone see the screen properly?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So first, let me say thank you to Alexandra Sandu, Martin Klimke, Raya Lakova, for all of their assistance, not only with this talk, but the tremendous work that they did to relocate me and my family from the United States to Abu Dhabi in the midst of a pandemic. It really is a tremendous pleasure and a privilege to be here at NYU Abu Dhabi this year. And I'd also like to thank Suphan Kırmızı Altan for moderating today's discussion and for her very generous introduction. So I just want to put up a table of contents for our viewers today, sort of in light of the sort of time limitations and our Zoom format. What I've chosen to do is to really focus my remarks on Imperial Mecca on chapter 3, which is about pandemic cholera and quarantine, and really sits at the heart of the book. Really, cholera pervaded everything that I wrote about in this project, and was sort of the starting point in many respects for this project. So despite the focus, I do hope that it will be possible in the Q&A for us to touch on other parts of the book, whether it be international law and extraterritoriality, or steamship mobility and regulation, or even the envirotechnical history of camels and the Hijaz Railway, which again, all are sort of tangled up in this question of cholera management throughout this period. So here I just wanted to throw up a map of the Indian Ocean Hajj routes, the steamship routes, and just say that the bulk of this book takes place, of course, in the Ottoman Hijaz, in Mecca and Medina, and in the Red Sea. But my hope is that the book as a whole will offer an example of a kind of thick trans-regional or trans-imperial history, and that through its use of Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, and colonial sources, it offers a kind of hybrid kind of history with the source base, with the depth of area studies regional work, but with the kind of scope and scale and creativity of colonial historiography and the toolbox of international and global history. So with all of that said, I want to start with a bit of a vignette, start with a kind of a micro history, if you will. So on the 19th of September, 1891, the postal steamer Nimeti Huda arrived in Istanbul. The steamship had completed its return journey from the Hijaz after the conclusion of the Hajj. One of the passengers on board the steamship was named Samsunlu Haji Mustafa Effendi. The following day, it was reported that Haji Mustafa had been laid up in bed with a suspected case of cholera. Haji Mustafa lived on a side street off Çeşme Meydana Caddesi in Galata, placing him in the middle of Istanbul's second most populous district, home to some, at the time, 220,000 souls, or roughly a quarter of Istanbul's urban population at the time. In the span of 3 or 4 days, the panic induced by Haji Mustafa's symptoms, whereabouts, and contacts attracted the attention of Ottoman officials of virtually every level and description, from municipal authorities in Beyoğlu, the police and the gendarme, to the international delegates of the Board of Health, the Health Ministry, Naval Ministry, the Grand Vizier, and even the Sultan himself. As I read these words that I wrote, now several years ago, it's quite funny to talk about Ottoman contact tracing, but in the world of COVID, that's what springs to mind. Now, as the case unfolded, an Austrian physician was dispatched to Haji Mustafa's home to examine him. Suspecting cholera, the alarm was raised. Copies of his examination were forwarded to the Ministry of Health. Municipal authorities in Beyoğlu were called in, and the gendarme was put in place to guard the patient, putting him under a sanitary cordon. The guards placed outside the door would in turn discover that there were several women inside the home. The municipal government was called in to provide welfare assistance for bread and other necessities. Meanwhile, the Naval Ministry was instructed to tow the Nimeti Huda either outside of Fenerbahce or Yenikapı, and place the vessel under a 10 to 12-day quarantine. The crew of the steamship was to be rounded up and placed under quarantine as well. There was also the need to locate and examine as many of Haji Mustafa's fellow passengers as possible. With the approval of the Sultan, special instructions were sent to the Mutasarrif of Beyoğlu and the Ministry of Police, urging that extreme care be taken in the event of Haji Mustafa's death. It was recommended that his corpse be taken far outside of the city and buried in a very deep grave and lined with lime. In addition to the removal of the corpse, it was also ordered that all of his personal items be disinfected or burned. So here on your screen, you'll see a map, and sort of ground zero for this story is the peninsula, which juts towards the sort of bottom left of your screen. And you'll see Galata and Pera, and of course the areas of Haskoy and Kasımpaşa. This is sort of the urban geography of the European side of Istanbul, in which this case unfolds. In the midst of these frightening precautions, in his correspondence with the Ministry of Health, the Grand Vizier candidly spelled out his fear that this case might be the start of the next devastating epidemic in Istanbul. He reflected back on the devastation that Istanbul had suffered during the Great Cholera outbreak of 1865. As he explained, it had only taken one instance of negligence to allow an infected steamer to enter the Golden Horn, visiting disaster and calamity on the entire population. In 1865, a devastating cholera outbreak had ravaged the Hijaz. Steamers of returning pilgrims carried cholera back across the Red Sea to Cairo and Alexandria. In turn, cholera made its way from Egypt to Istanbul on board an Ottoman corvette, a small warship, transporting a tuberculosis-stricken official, one Osman Pasha. Although communication between the infected ports of the Red Sea, Egypt, and Istanbul had been placed under strict quarantine measures, on its return journey, the crew had thrown 2 cholera victims into the sea, of course, subverting the whole idea of those quarantines in the first place. Now, the vessel went straight into the naval yard at Tersane, and that very same evening, 2 soldiers were admitted to the Tersane hospital. Within days, cholera spread to the surrounding neighborhoods of Haskoy and Kasımpaşa. The outbreaks would rage on for 4 months, killing as many as 1,000 per day at their height, leaving a death toll of as many as 30,000 by the epidemic's end. As Sadri Sima reports, the 1865 outbreak was so devastating that for every 8 or 10 people attending a funeral of a cholera victim, 5 or 6 might die along the way to the original victim's funeral ceremony. Even if this is a bit of hyperbole, one gets the sense of the immediacy of the tragedy. So on your screen, you'll see some photographs for those of you who may not be familiar with Istanbul. In your top left, you'll see the Golden Horn and the Tersane Naval Yard. And then on the bottom left and right hand of your screen, you'll see pictures of Galata and Pera. As Ahmed Javad reviewed the precautions being taken, he could not help but wonder whether Haji Mustafa and the Nimeti Huda might not be the source of the city's next great catastrophe. In light of the anxieties produced by this case, a scientific committee composed of members of the Board of Health and faculty from the Imperial Medical College were assembled to evaluate Haji Mustafa. Despite all of the precautions requested by the Ministry of Health, according to the Medical Commission, Haji Mustafa apparently did not in fact have cholera after all. They argued that it was only a case of dysentery and extreme exhaustion from the 3-month journey to the Hijaz and back. As the committee pointed out, due to the impoverished and unsanitary state of the home, the patient could not be properly treated and should be transferred to a hospital for treatment. Within 3 days of the report, however, Haji Mustafa was dead and buried in accordance with the protocols laid out for a cholera death. Although the Grand Vizierate would later complain of how very absurd these measures had been, even after it was determined that the victim had only suffered from a diarrheal illness. Even the confusion and bureaucratic infighting, international ramifications, and second-guessing surrounding this single suspected case of cholera provide us with a vivid sense of the epidemiological anxiety that must have hung over Istanbul like a fog at the turn of the century. Now, Here, I would just note that the wrangling over whether this was or was not a cholera case is actually something that was common to both British India and the Ottoman Empire. No one wanted to admit cholera cases, right, because of the grave global implications and the possibility, not unlike our own situation right now, that the city would be thrown into a state of confusion, quarantine. There would, of course, be financial and economic ramifications that would follow from it. Now, the documentary record surrounding Haji Mustafa, his body, his family, home, and the preparations for his burial, to my mind, offers a succinct yet panoramic vignette of the social and administrative life of the Ottoman Empire during the multi-decade reign of epidemic cholera. It also provides a kind of starting point for unpacking the disciplinary mechanisms and modernizing public health reforms that cholera helped to produce. The anxieties and memories of the past mistakes experienced in the 1860s in particular, dredged up by Haji Mustafa's suspected cholera case, concisely illustrate a pattern that was to become all too familiar to both European and Ottoman physicians and officials during this period. So here we have a sort of a list of the major outbreaks experienced in the Muslim Holy Land in the Hijaz. By the 1890s, both the Hijaz and Istanbul were living in perpetual terror of the next microbial disaster imported via the Hajj from India, the endemic cradle of cholera. Between 1831 and 1914, cholera spread from India to the Hijaz on at least 40 separate occasions. After 1865, but especially between 1881 and 1895, a global cholera pandemic smoldered continuously from India to the Mediterranean. Throughout this period, cholera remained in almost constant circulation, flaring up for extended periods in virtually every corner of the Ottoman Empire, especially along its Indian Ocean frontiers on the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. By the 1890s, tragic scenes of human loss and social and administrative confusion that came in their wake had become repeated with alarming regularity for more than half of a century. The Hijaz had seen outbreaks of varying severity in 1831, 1834, 36, 40, 46, 51, 56 through 58, and 1860. And then, of course, there was the great Hajj Akbar of 1865, which had killed between 15,000 and 30,000 pilgrims and sparked a global outbreak. The 1870s witnessed outbreaks in 1872, 1876, and again in 1877-78. In the 1880s and 90s, cholera's visitations would continue to only intensify. Cholera broke out during every Hajj season between 1881 and 1883. In 1883, the outbreak once again spread to Egypt, killing approximately 50,000. And again, 4 of the 6 pilgrimage seasons between 1890 and 1895 also produced outbreaks, reaching a gory crescendo again in the Hajj Akbar season of 1893. Estimates of the death toll for that year range from as many as 30,000 up to 50,000. In the fallout from the carnage of the 1893 cholera in the Hijaz, Istanbul was also afflicted and lost some 1,340 souls between outbreaks in 1893-94 and 1895. Although, of course, it was nothing compared to the devastation visited upon Istanbul in 1865, as we shall see, the outbreaks of the 1890s marked a critical turning point in the slow maturation of the sanitary reorganization of the empire as a whole, Istanbul, the Hijaz, and the Red Sea in particular. Now, as Nuket Varlik, Sam White, and Alan McHale have all pointed out, the early modern Ottoman Empire had its own particular imperial ecology. Agricultural goods and raw materials were constantly being extracted to feed the imperial capital, sustain the Ottoman military's sprawling mobilization. At the same time, however, those very same circuits that mobilized and circulated the empire's crops, livestock, people, and minerals could just as easily be used to convey epidemic diseases, most notably bubonic plague. Likewise, the ecologies of Egypt, Anatolia, and the Balkans were inseparable from the whole of Ottoman environmental history and vice versa. At the same time, however, that larger Ottoman ecosystem was overlapped and penetrated by environmental forces originating from well beyond its borders. Indeed, the very idea of empire as an ecosystem points to the artificiality of traditional political spatial divisions. In the case of cholera, like plague before it, this point is made painfully clear. Time and again, cholera laid bare the Hijaz's newly vulnerable position as a trans-imperial nexus of the steamship era, linking the imperial ecologies of the Ottoman domains with British India and the wider Indian Ocean, linking the Indian Ocean into a kind of unified disease zone. Now, each time that steam-powered cholera leapt across the Indian Ocean and struck the Hijaz, it exponentially raised the likelihood that the disease would bloom across the width and breadth of the empire and beyond as pilgrims returned to their homes, unwittingly carrying devastating microbes with them. Returning pilgrims like Haji Mustafa had a way of bringing the instability of the Indian Ocean frontier home to the imperial center, laying its biopolitical and environmental insecurity at the feet of imperial power. Now, in the book, in both chapters 3 and 4, I explore how cholera annihilated the presumed difference between a modernizing Istanbul and the supposedly, quote unquote, backward Arabian frontier. It examines how the infrastructures and procedures of sanitary and environmental discipline necessary to contain the death and destruction produced by cholera at the same time collapsed time and space and intimately bound the imperial capital to its unruly frontiers. Put slightly differently, cholera had a way of generalizing the frontier. Quarantine and medical surveillance measures were not just a matter of building sanitary checkpoints on the desert islands of the Red Sea. Rather, the defenses built up and directed outward against the Red Sea invasions of cholera-carrying Indian Ocean pilgrims were merely the most obvious physical manifestations of the disciplinary mechanisms that tracked, diagnosed, and treated suspected victims of cholera like Haji Mustafa. Now, in this sense, the multi-layered practices and infrastructures of medical surveillance and environmental discipline being strengthened in the Tanzimat and Hamidian era empire were only as effective as their application and execution at the absolute geographical and logistical margins of the empire. As a result, from the 1860s onward, but especially from the 1890s, the Hijaz was by no means exempt from the increasingly invasive sanitary and envirotechnical interventions being imposed on the residents of Istanbul and the core of the Ottoman state. As this chapter shows, the new technologies of bacteriological science, urban sanitation, disinfection, and water safety, tested and refined in Istanbul and elsewhere, rapidly found their way to the Hijaz and the quarantine sites of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. So here I'd just like to sort of underscore this, that quite often, one of the things I was frustrated with while I was researching this project was the sort of sensibility in the colonial historiography and the sort of history of medicine historiography that Europe was engaged in a kind of sanitary project to sort of save itself, right, from cholera, that there was this tremendous effort being made. And one of the things that I'd like to insert here is that in many respects, Istanbul's efforts to protect both Europe and itself from Indian Ocean cholera have been sort of left out of the narrative, when in fact Istanbul and the Ottoman Empire were one of the most important laboratories for this research. Now, it's really difficult to imagine a more gruesome or frightening death than cholera. Cholera is, of course, an acute diarrheal infection caused by exposure to unclean water contaminated with fecal matter containing the bacterium Vibrio cholerae. Although most of those infected will experience either mild or no symptoms, even these seemingly healthy individuals continue to carry the bacteria in their feces for as long as 7 to 14 days after infection, unknowingly infecting others at every turn. For those who do develop acute symptoms, owing to its rapid incubation time ranging from just a few hours up to a few days, an otherwise healthy person can die in less than a day. Cholera kills, of course, by binding to the receptor cells in the small intestine, responsible for the absorption and retention of chloride and consequently sodium. As a result, water rapidly drains from the body's cells and is dumped into the intestine. As victims succumb to the disease's characteristic rice water diarrhea, they can lose up to many liters of fluids per hour. The relentless diarrhea is, of course, followed by vomiting. The voiding of all of the body's fluids leads to catastrophic dehydration, crashing electrolytes, fevers, chills, severe cramping, and even shock. Of course, left untreated, roughly half of cholera victims will succumb to the disease. Now, in the images that you see here, we see sort of a gruesome sense of the sort of cholera prevailing in urban centers, whether it be in Britain or as far away as New York City. And of course, the ravages, the sort of zombie-like cadaverous appearance of the victims. Now, of course, over the long 19th century, millions of Muslim men, women, and children crowded into the holds of slow-moving steamers bound for Mecca. Seasick, clinging to their belongings, and often deprived of the most basic arrangements for clean water and sanitation, they endured weeks of misery en route from Bombay, Calcutta, or Singapore to Arabia. Along the way, the claustrophobic spaces below decks provided a veritable petri dish for cholera's incubation and spread from one captive to another. And as cholera's regular visitations on pilgrimage steamers and in Mecca itself became increasingly predictable, solemnly enduring discomfort and bravely facing down an unimaginably horrific death became a normal, indeed even integral part of ordinary Muslims' Hajj experience. Just as individuals suffered and died under cholera's cruel reign, on a larger geopolitical and administrative scale, the Ottoman Empire was also victimized by this distinctly colonial scourge. Since early modern times, of course, the Ottoman Empire had been managing the fallout from epidemic diseases and natural disasters, from plague to droughts, famines, floods, fires, and earthquakes. Indeed, recent scholarship has pointed to the long evolution and resilience of the empire's disaster relief systems. Now, in the context of the massive restructuring and modernization of the state undertaken during the Tanzimat and Hamidian periods, however, late Ottoman responses to natural disasters gained a renewed significance. As tragic as an earthquake, a flood, or a fire might have been, these events also represented opportunities for transformation. And while modernizing practices brought increased expectations for immediate delivery of welfare relief, from foodstuffs to shelter, Ottoman authorities were also emboldened to radically redesign urban landscapes. Repeated cholera outbreaks, of course, were no different in this regard. These tragic events brought new opportunities to test the latest techno-scientific tools and infrastructures of bacteriological science, disinfection, quarantine, and urban sanitation, from the construction of new sewer systems to the reorganization of municipal water supplies. In other words, 19th century disasters opened new spaces, indeed living laboratories, for experiments of Ottoman modernization. At the same time, however, orchestrating the urban reorganization of Istanbul in the wake of an earthquake or a fire, or even the overhaul of the capital's water and sewerage systems, arguably represented a more manageable challenge than the vexing inter-imperial puzzle of cholera prevention along the empire's vast and porous southern frontiers. From a purely fiscal and logistical perspective, reproducing the sanitary reforms being pioneered in Istanbul and the state's centralized core and transporting them to the empire's southernmost autonomous extremities was daunting enough in its own right. Of course, to complicate matters, new notions of bacteriology, urban sanitation, quarantine, and disinfection were all met with varying degrees of suspicion and resistance by foreign pilgrims, urban Hijazis, and Bedouins. On the ground, of course, sanitary reforms and quarantine measures were frequently framed as an un-Islamic innovation and further evidence of Europe's growing influence over the administration of the Hijaz and the Hajj. To a degree, of course, this was partly true. The Ottoman Board of Health was an international body subject to capitulatory extraterritorial oversight by European representatives. However, it would be a mistake to view Istanbul's imposition of stricter sanitary and quarantine policies as solely a product of European pressure. As this chapter details, the medicalization of the frontier was well suited to the centralizing impulses of Istanbul's Tanzimat and later Hamidian-era statesmen and bureaucrats. Quarantines increased border controls, and the sanitary reorganization of the Hijaz and wider Red Sea offered the Ottoman state critical opportunities to strengthen its administrative reach and underscore the empire's territorial sovereignty. And this is, I can't stress this enough, it was all done ostensibly under the banner of diplomatic cooperation and international legal recognition, under the banner of the International Sanitary Conferences. Now, on the other hand, Istanbul's position on the front lines of the international struggle against cholera was a very lonely and deeply frustrating struggle. Unlike earlier instances of disease and natural disaster, Ottoman officials no longer viewed cholera as an act of God. Istanbul had an increasingly clear understanding of cholera as a man-made microbial crisis, produced and exacerbated by British colonial policies in India. From Yemen, the Hijaz, and Iraq to Istanbul itself, the ecological fallout of British colonialism loomed like a monsoon cloud sweeping over Ottoman lands. And just as the Hijaz was increasingly subject to the extraterritorial political and legal influences radiating from the Indian Ocean, it was equally vulnerable to the explosion of human suffering, dislocation, and deadly microbes being unleashed by the predations of the British Raj. The deeper that India sank into its own ecological crises, the more that the Hijaz and the broader Ottoman ecosystem bore the brunt of its steam-powered collateral damage. Ottoman authorities, of course, did their best to leverage the weak mechanisms of international diplomacy to protect the empire and Europe itself from a disaster largely of Britain's creation. Yet, even as international scientific opinion coalesced around India's position at the epicenter of the global cholera pandemic, Ottoman officials were confronted with a British colonial state virulently opposed to the emerging bacteriological consensus surrounding cholera's transmission, and equally determined to deny their own culpability in the creation of the crisis or their further responsibility to mitigate its tragic effects. Now, here I would just point out it's been very difficult to watch the events that have unfolded, for example, in the United States. The sort of denial around COVID testing and the depth of the crisis has continuously struck me as quite similar to the denial that I read in British and Ottoman files emanating from India itself. So I hope in the Q&A we can talk about some of the sort of colonial legacies that we see here. Now, having introduced some of the sort of basic terrain of cholera in the book, with the rest of the time that I have here, I'd like to speak just very briefly and offer kind of a preview, almost a movie trailer, if you will, of some of the highlights of the research in this chapter and the rest of the book, and really sort of think towards the relevance that this might have in our present moment. So here we see a map. This was the work of Besim Omer, of course, later in the beginning of the 20th century, but we see a very clear map, Ottoman map, showing this sort of outward radiation of cholera from India. And throughout this period, British India denied that India was the epicenter of cholera. And in fact, British propaganda sought to blame Mecca as the epicenter of the outbreaks. This, of course, was one of the topics that was broached in the many international sanitary conferences held throughout the 19th century. Of course, maybe the most notable one was held in Istanbul in 1866 after the great 1865 cholera outbreak. And its sort of main conclusions really sort of set the tone really for the rest of the 19th century and early 20th century, and created a framework for early cooperation on international public health. And of course, the two principal conclusions were that cholera was, its epicenter, its endemic cradle was India, and that it was transmissible from person to person, which of course, then in turn, the British spent the rest of the century denying. So one of the things that struck me throughout my research was the degree to which the great figures of bacteriology and epidemiology of the late 19th century, here in the middle of the screen we see Robert Koch, but we could also apply this to Pasteur. The sort of latest advances in bacteriological science were taken up by the works of Ottoman experts. Here on the left we see a treatise written in the 1890s by Hamdi bin Aziz, of course on cholera. And one of the great ironies is that colonial authorities in India held on to localist miasma theories for most of the latter half of the 19th century, where the Ottomans adopted the very latest bacteriological science. So when we talk about the sick man of Europe in the case of the Ottoman Empire, perhaps this is not so well deserved. Of course, throughout this period, we see Ottoman attempts to really get a handle on the crisis that was unfolding in the Hijaz, sending multiple commissions to monitor the health of the pilgrimage, and eventually in 1882, opening up a quarantine station on Cameron Island, which is off the northern coast of Yemen. You see the red dot representing its position in the Red Sea. Of course, this was a major source of friction and controversy between the two empires. Of course, the anti-quarantine lobby in both Britain and India was virulently opposed to the opening of the station to check pilgrims, of course, because they felt like this was one step closer to an outright embargo on trade flowing through the Red Sea from India, which of course would have been disastrous for Britain. I would just say that this was sort of the jumping off point for the project. These photos were actually taken in 2006, 2007 when I was studying Arabic in Yemen. And this is really the remains of the Ottoman and British facilities that were built on Cameron Island from the 1880s through the 1950s. One of the other characters that I just would like to take a very quick moment to underscore is Charles Bunkowski Pasha. And I have a section in the book where I sort of play on Bruno Latour's idea of the pasteurization of France and sort of take up the idea that Bunkowski Pasha and others were responsible for a kind of parallel pasteurization of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, Bunkowski Pasha was an immigrant from Poland, educated in Paris. He became the head chemist of the Sultan in the 1890s, and of course was president of the Society of Pharmacists in Istanbul, and later went on to become the chief health inspector in the 1890s of Istanbul, and as well a delegate to multiple international sanitary conferences. And one of the things that I like so much about Bunkowski Pasha is that his work and his reform projects to try and get a handle on the quarantine procedures and all of the possible ways to mitigate cholera really shows us that instead of the sort of typical public health narrative around the Ottoman Empire, it wasn't as if Europe was imposing this. In fact, in many respects, the Ottoman Empire was pushing Europe to take a stronger stance to mitigate the multiple waves of cholera outbreak. And one of the things that I focus on is this sort of pinging back and forth, right, of international influences, local influences in the Hijaz, and also events that are happening in Istanbul. In this slide, we see in the 1890s, of course, Istanbul experienced a devastating earthquake in 1894. Also, the reorganization of its water system. We see a diagram here to the right. And all of this was happening simultaneously, right? As Istanbul was trying to reckon with these overlapping crises, it was learning, and what it was learning in the heart of the empire was then projecting and trying to apply to its imperial frontiers, of course, with mixed results. Of course, there was international cooperation. Here we see André Chantemesse, who was an assistant to Pasteur, who was dispatched by the French embassy to assist with various cholera prevention procedures and set up disinfection machines in the capital and eventually in the Hijaz. We see to the left the Imperial Bacteriology Laboratory, which was of course pioneered during this period as well. So again, we have this constant dialogue between the international level, the imperial capital level, and then the frontier as well. In this section of the book, a couple of things that really sort of leapt out for me were, and I wrote sort of separately an article about this, Ottoman desalination procedures to attempt to provide potable drinking water, which was also applied on Cameron Island. But of course, this diagram shows a machine that was imported from Scotland to Jeddah right before World War I. And this was probably the biggest surprise of my research and has really launched my second book project, which I've started on here at NYU Abu Dhabi on the history of desalination technology in the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Arabian Peninsula. And finally, we also see disinfection equipment, attempts to use autoclaves to cleanse pilgrims' clothes. Of course, these techniques were pioneered in Istanbul, but when they were brought in the 1890s and 1895 to the Hijaz, riots broke out, right? The machines were smashed, hospital authorities were attacked, and in fact, the consular authorities of the British, the French, and the Russians were attacked, and one vice consul that figures quite notably in my book, an Indian Muslim, Dr. Abdur Razak, was murdered in the midst of the sort of uproar over new Ottoman sanitary procedures, right? So we see the sort of difficulties for the modernizing Ottoman Empire to extend these new technologies to the frontier. Now, of course, this process doesn't end with World War I. The process of coming out of the sort of internationalization, right, of cholera prevention measures drags on into the middle of the 20th century. So all of the precautions that were pioneered by the Ottomans, in many respects, were inherited during and after World War I by empires like the British and the Dutch. And in fact, Cameron Island, the quarantine station, was taken over in 1926 and run through the 1950s by the British and Dutch empires. And one of the things that has struck me throughout this pandemic is really to think about, it really hasn't been that long since there was de facto international control of the Hajj. And so as the events of this year and the extreme social distancing of the Hajj, the sort of mini Hajj that took place this year unfolded, I couldn't help but think about how well Saudi Arabia actually in the end handled this situation. And in many respects, Saudi Arabia carries a kind of double responsibility, right? Because the memories of the international takeover in many respects of the international sort of trans-imperial dimensions of the Hajj that occurred between the 1860s and the 1950s, that lingers in the memory of Saudi Arabia. And so protecting pilgrims from COVID this year was of course paramount, but also Saudi Arabia carries a double responsibility of really protecting the rest of the international community from potential pandemics. And I found this particularly interesting because in the West, both in Europe and the United States, we've seen a quite poor job in many respects of handling the pandemic, whereas in the Arabian Peninsula and East Asia, we've seen more robust responses. And again, in the West, a sort of inability to learn in some respects, whereas thankfully, in the case of Saudi Arabia, the sort of lingering scars of the pandemic past of Mecca really seem to have borne some fruit in the successes of this year's Hajj. So I want to leave things there. I hope that I've provided some food for thought for discussion. I'm just going to leave up the table of contents if people want to refer to the rest of the book and think a little bit more broadly about Imperial Mecca. Thank you for your time, and I guess I'll bring in Supan for Q&A.
Chris,
yes.
Is my video on? Can
yes.
You guys? Yeah. Okay. But I only see your screen. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and congratulations one more time on your book. Your work is a very valuable contribution to the growing literature on the environmental and epidemiological history of the Ottoman Middle East. And not everyone in the audience might be aware of this, but environmental history is a relatively new area of interest for Ottomanists. And your study does really a great job at, sort of moving it from a niche topic or niche area of interest towards a more mainstream, if you will, mode of history writing by successfully demonstrating that international and domestic politics, which are really the bread and butter of the 19th century Ottoman historiography, that they are intertwined with ecological and environmental questions and other relevant issues such as public health and management of natural resources. This is something, the question of environmental history is something I'm hoping that we might be able to come back to it, to discuss it in a bit more detail later, but there are some questions and comments from the audience, and I would like to start with those first, if that's okay for you.
Yes.
Okay, Masha says, thank you for this fascinating talk. Can you speak a bit more about the financing of Ottoman measures to mitigate cholera and quarantine measures? She says, you mentioned that Ottoman Board of Health is subject to capitulatory mechanisms, right? Do the Ottomans, as a result, find themselves in a compromised position when engaging in international dialogue with the British, who are denying their own role in producing the crisis in India and shifting the blame to Mecca? On what level might have such pressures and constraints played out at the international sanitary conferences or in domestic affairs?
This is a great question, and it really is sort of one of the cruxes of the book, right? The first part of the book deals with really international law and the development of extraterritorial influence of the British and other European powers in the Hijaz, which is, it's quite shocking, right? To think of sort of colonial interference in the Muslim Holy Land. But of course, extraterritoriality in the Ottoman Empire was the sort of primary mode through which colonial empires dealt with Istanbul. And so there was a sort of double-edged sword in dealing with international sanitary affairs, right? So on the one hand, the Ottoman Empire was quite eager to engage this way. There has been a body of literature about the eagerness with which Istanbul engaged in international societies and international legal affairs, in part because it gave them a modicum of protection, right? They could claim that under international law, that their sovereignty ought to be upheld. Now, on the other hand, right, this placed European officials directly in the midst of the internal affairs of the conduct of business in a quite sensitive area. You mentioned the question of finance. So this was really one of the more galling areas for the Ottomans. A tariff in the 1860s and 70s was worked out, I believe 1872. The tariff was imposed, so a tonnage-based system in order to raise money for the upkeep of the quarantines and sanitary surveillance in the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Black Sea. So of course, this issue was not just confined to the Hijaz itself. This was a more global set of questions. But of course, the British went kicking and screaming, and constantly throughout the final decades of the 19th century continued to claim that the only reason that the Ottomans charged for visas, passports, sanitary fees it was the sort of a scheme, right, to make money. If you actually look at the Ottoman records, none of these fees would have possibly paid for all of the labor and construction and upkeep of these facilities, right? So they often bore the brunt, again, of British India's incompetence or cruelty in many respects. And so the sort of results of European colonialism were passed on, and the Ottomans had to sort of bear this sort of double burden, right, of protecting themselves, protecting the Muslim Holy Land, but also acting as a kind of shield and buffer for Europe itself, right? So the idea was that the Suez Canal was sort of the last line of defense against sort of Asian pilgrims bringing in cholera to the Mediterranean. So this really was the kind of upsetting position that the Ottomans faced. And in fact, you can hear in the, or see, right, in the transcripts of the international sanitary conferences, the direct complaints. And I have one quote in the book by one Ottoman representative, and he said very succinctly, look, if you want to understand the failures of quarantine in the Ottoman Empire, look at European officials, because they are in fact themselves the representatives of the Board of Health. So this is not an Ottoman policy, this is a European policy. And you can just imagine the frustration for Istanbul.
Thank you. On this issue of the British narrative on the pandemic, that reminds me of this idea of epidemiological Orientalism, which was developed by Nükhet Varlık in her work on the plague in the Ottoman lands. And so it is this idea of, or set of discourses generated by European travelers who were writing about the Ottoman experience of plague, where they construct the Orient or the Ottoman Levant specifically as the as the site and source of the sickness. So Varlık sees this as yet another way of distinguishing the civilized European land from the disease-ridden Ottoman Empire, which, as you pointed out, was not coincidentally called as the sick man of Europe in the 19th century European literature. So she argues that European epidemiological epistemology on plague cannot really be isolated from the international political context of the 19th century in which it was developed. And she says that this epistemology continues to inform the history writing, the historiography on the subject today. So do you see parallels between the European discourses on plague and as an Oriental disease and the British narrative on Hajj-related cholera? And would you agree that this narrative is a part of a larger epidemiological Orientalist construct?
I would definitely agree. I mean, in the documents, of course, for the 19th century, we don't refer to cholera. We see Asiatic cholera, right? So this tendency to name by a place and to associate a particular geography and people, right, with the disease. And of course, one can't help but see the sad parallels with our own case, right, of Donald Trump, you know, constantly referring to SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 as the Chinese disease, right? So we get this. This is not neither a new thing, but it's not something that we have outgrown. We continue to have this, again, epistemological Orientalism. The thing that I would say that's interesting to me about this, it's double-edged. Again, there's an Ottoman discourse that goes alongside this European discourse, right? So the Ottomans themselves, in many respects, if we follow Osama Muqtasi's work about Ottoman Orientalism, they imbibed many of the ideas that were coming from European officials and scholars, and of course, tended to see the frontier, the Arab southern frontier in places like Hijaz, Yemen, Iraq, Libya, as, of course, somehow environmentally deficient, diseased, difficult to deal with, and the sort of ways in which they saw the environmental and epidemiological defects of these regions was intertwined with their view of the inhabitants themselves, right? So there is a kind of two layers to this in this period.
Can you briefly elaborate on that idea of Ottoman Orientalism? In your book, you also refer to the technocratic gaze of the Central Ottoman government, their attempts at harnessing technology to establish control over the Arab borderlands, southern borderlands, and maybe even bringing the borderland people into the fold of, you know, Ottoman civilization. So how is that? Is this any different from the British colonial view or the European Orientalist discourses, or if it is, how so?
I'll try and pick that apart in two parts. I mean, I think the first question on this sort of technocratic gaze, right? So one of the things that I try to do in the book is to say there are sort of two competing forces that I see. On the one hand, there's a modernizing Istanbul that's trying to centralize and bring its frontiers sort of closer in, homogenize its rule across its territory. On the other hand, you have a sort of extraterritorial advancement of British India and colonialism, imperialism more generally, that is a force that's sort of ripping away frontier territories, Egypt, the Balkans, Hijaz, Yemen, Iraq, tearing them away from the empire. And so one of the things that I found most interesting in my study of the Hijaz was that there was a constant sort of soul searching, right, in the Hamidian period, that the Tanzimat period had failed to really centralize and homogenize. So what would be the strategy? You had to have a more adaptable, nimble strategy to these Bedouin autonomous regions. And I think that there was a recognition on the part of the Hamidian regime that you couldn't just go in and say, okay, we'll send the army in, centralize the Hijaz, get rid of the Sharif of Mecca. There were certainly officials who advocated for that, but Abdulhamid and his sort of, coterie of core officials said, this won't work. This is not possible to just sort of wholly reinvent these regions from scratch. So part of their idea was to bring in these new governmental technologies, these new forms of discipline, whether it be epidemiological science, quarantines, telegraphs, railways, to bring the frontier closer to the empire. And at the end of the day, I'm getting a note apparently that I should stop sharing my screen. Is that better?
I only see you actually. I don't see your screen, yes. But it's all good.
So, as I was saying, this attempt really was a sort of to sort of bring the frontier, and the Ottoman Empire ran out of time. Right by World War I, these really ambitious technological projects couldn't all be accomplished, right? And you couldn't bring the frontier close enough. And those same forces that were sort of ripping at the frontiers ended up with, the Ottoman Empire in defeat. And I would just say that I think it's worthwhile for us to think about the failures of the empire, right? It doesn't mean that they didn't have some successes. And that whole process of trying to sort of strike a middle path to acknowledge the previous constitutional frameworks of the autonomous provinces, but also to learn from sort of colonial governance is really a feature of the late 19th century. And so even in failure, I think we can learn something about the shape of Tanzimat and Hamidian governments. Your second question, if you can remind me the sort of second part.
I was asking how, or if at all, this is different from the British Orientalist discourse about the region. I mean, is Ottoman Orientalism in its approach to the borderland populations different from British Orientalism, British Orientalist discourse? Mm-hmm.
Certainly. I mean, I think that one of the things that, one of the discourses that I was interested in as I was writing, I mean, I was reading people like Thomas Kuhn, his work on Yemen, of course, Osama Makdisi, Salim Deringil, and later Mustafa Minawi, and this debate on, were the Ottomans colonial, or was there Ottoman colonialism, if you will. And at the end of the day, I came down on the side that we must distinguish clearly between Ottoman adaptations or methodologies that may borrow from Europe and processes of colonialism, right? Because the power differential, the gap is quite wide, right? And also, it's not as if we're sort of working with a tabula rasa. We're not, working with a clean slate. The previous processes of autonomous rule and methodologies in the Ottoman toolkit were certainly still being used, but of course with some learning from other colonial empires.
I'm afraid we ran out of time as well, like the Ottoman government. So even though I have many more questions to ask about your work, and I'm sure our other colleagues will be interested in continuing this conversation in socially distant environments, I think it's time for us to conclude our conversation about the history of the Hajj-related cholera pandemic and its management in the Ottoman Empire. Thank you very much, Chris, one more time for this very interesting talk and very stimulating conversations, and congratulations one more time for your book, and thank you everyone for tuning in today.
Thank you, Supan. Thank you everyone for tuning in. If you've got questions, please reach out to me via email. I look forward to hearing from you.